Welcome to this explainer. Today we're unpacking a worldview that is, well, as sweeping as it is controversial. We're going to be looking at geopolitical analyst Professor Jiang, who has proposed a really grand theory of hidden global power, secret societies, and ultimately unavoidable systemic collapse. So let's just dive right in.
I want you to think about this for a second. What if some of the absolute biggest events shaping our world right now are not simply the result of governments or wars or markets, but actually of networks operating quietly right behind them? Today, we're putting these extraordinary claims under a microscope. We're going to establish a really clear editorial framework right from the start, carefully separating documented facts and plausible theories from pure, unadulterated speculation.
Chapter 1. The World Behind the World.
So Jiang proposes this pretty radical concept that he calls a power trinity. Instead of the usual messy, competing national interests that we're used to, he envisions this highly structured, hidden alliance. It works like this. Occultists imagine the endgame. Financiers, the guys with the money, fund that vision, and politicians, well, they're just identified and elevated as useful pawns to actually execute it all. It's a wildly different way of looking at how global influence operates.
Which brings us to Chapter 2, Elites and Occult Traditions.
Jiang actually traces this hidden influence back centuries. It's not a modern invention in his eyes. He starts with the profound trauma of the 1492 expulsion of Jews from Spain, which triggered this massive crisis of faith. Then, we jump ahead to 1666, when a man named Sabbatai Zevi declared himself the Messiah, only to shockingly convert to Islam just to survive. By the 18th century, a successor named Jacob Frank pushed these exact beliefs to a radical extreme. And it's this specific esoteric lineage that Jiang claims still haunts elite networks today.
Right at the heart of Jacob Frank's philosophy was this incredibly dangerous radical concept known as redemption by sin. The core idea here was that by intentionally breaking societal taboos, by committing sins and essentially destroying the moral order of the entire world, you would actually force God to return and save humanity. I mean, think about that. It's an incredibly seductive idea, especially for powerful people who simply don't want to be bound by normal rule anyway.
Now, according to Jiang, this isn't just some dusty ancient theology. He sees it as an aggressive, modern geopolitical blueprint, bringing the diaspora back to Jerusalem, achieving the Greater Israel Project, and building the Third Temple. These are, in his view, the extreme, literal steps these groups believe will repair the world and force the end of days. It's taking ancient mysticism and applying it as a modern political program.
And that brings us to the Epstein question. Look, Jeffrey Epstein is a figure of documented wealth with verifiable, very high-level connections to billionaires and politicians. We know that for a fact. But here is where we absolutely must draw a strict line between verifiable reality and Jiang's speculation. Jiang hypothesizes that Epstein's unexplained leverage actually came from acting as a secret agent for these occult networks, gathering blackmail to manipulate those political pawns we talked about earlier. Now, it's a fascinating narrative, sure, but we have to remember it remains an entirely unproven interpretation of the existing evidence.
Okay, let's pivot to some hard geopolitics in Chapter 3, the American Imperial Strategy.
Jiang points directly to the U.S. national defense strategy, arguing that American dominance relies heavily on three very active pillars. First up, absolute dominance of the Western Hemisphere, basically enforcing the Monroe Doctrine. Second, controlling vital global maritime chokepoints. Think of it like setting up a global toll booth over crucial waterways, like the Strait of Malacca. And third, actively creating and managing conflict across Eurasia.
So why create conflict? Well, he argues that by deliberately stoking fires across the Eurasian landmass, the U.S. ensures that the rest of the world remains fractured. And because they're fractured, they remain entirely dependent on the West for exactly three things: armaments to fight their wars, resources to fuel their economies, and U.S. dollar financing to pay for the whole shebang.
Now, it's really important that we contrast standard geopolitical realities with Jiang's much stronger claims here. Mainstream analysis tells us that the U.S. naturally secures trade routes, resources, and alliances, just to maintain its superpower status. That makes total sense, right? But Jiang's theory goes way further. He claims that hidden elite networks are intentionally pulling the strings to accelerate these global conflicts. In his view, they're deliberately manipulating governments to fulfill those extreme eschatological prophecies we were just talking about.
This leads us right into Chapter 4, Predicting Global Collapse.
Jiang actually outlines some highly specific
pretty drastic predictions that he believes will trigger massive global change. We're talking about a constitutional crisis culminating in a third term for Donald Trump, a catastrophic US ground invasion of Iran, and even the destruction of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now, obviously, these are entirely speculative forecasts, but they map absolutely perfectly onto his framework of engineered chaos.
Aside from the prophecy stuff, Jiang lays out a very structured sociological cycle of imperial decline. He argues that internal contradictions basically force empires into making fatal mistakes. It always starts with a gerontocracy, ruled by the elderly. Then it moves to stagnant bureaucracies, breeds massive inequality under the guise of meritocracy, creates way too many elites fighting for way too little power, leads to unwinnable foreign wars, and finally ends in a cascading, unavoidable collapse. It's like watching a train wreck in slow motion.
And all of this leads to his ultimate, incredibly sweeping conclusion. Jiang genuinely believes that within the next 50 years, the deeply interconnected nature of our world means that if the American empire falls, it's not going down alone. It's going to drag the entire global system down with it into complete, unmitigated chaos. Economically, culturally, politically, the whole system.
Time for our Analytical Center, Chapter 5, Fact versus Speculation.
Let's step back and use a sort of investigative ledger here to firmly categorize these claims, because we really need to know what can actually be verified. The US focus on maritime routes and Jeffrey Epstein's elite ties, that is documented. The idea that wealthy individuals leverage philanthropy for political access, highly plausible. We see it all the time. However, the claim that geopolitical wars are being intentionally triggered by hidden religious elites, that is wildly speculative. And a perfectly unified global secret society orchestrating world events, that remains completely unsupported by any credible evidence. You see, understanding global geopolitics requires recognizing a really messy reality. Yes, there absolutely are incredibly powerful institutions, billionaires with outsized influence, and completely opaque decision-making processes. But we have to contrast that reality with the seductive illusion of total control. History isn't a scripted movie. It's full of unintended consequences, massive blunders, and competing interests. It is rarely the work of a single, all-powerful hidden group pulling all the strings flawlessly.
Now, despite his rather extreme predictions of chaos, Jiang's advice for everyday individuals is actually surprisingly grounded. He focuses heavily on education, on questioning narratives, and fact-checking claims, even his own, by the way. He really emphasizes shifting your focus away from pure financial wealth and pointing it toward family, community, and human connection to build local resilience. Honestly, those are universally practical civic steps, no matter what kind of geopolitical uncertainty we're facing.
Which leaves us with one final, really provocative question. Why are theories about hidden power and impending collapse so deeply attractive to us during periods of geopolitical uncertainty? When inequality rises and the institutions we rely on seem to falter, we naturally search for a narrative that makes sense of the chaos. Sometimes, honestly, a terrifying theory of secret control is somehow more comforting than the reality that no one is truly driving the bus. So, we have to ask ourselves, are we seeking the truth, or are we just looking for a story that gives order to an unpredictable world? Definitely keep that in mind as you navigate the news. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep questioning.